Hey guys, tonight we begin with a slow wander through the lives of some of the most genetically adventurous monarchs Europe ever produced. So dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's float gently into the curious world of royal families who thought, for reasons only they could fully understand, that keeping things in the family was a great idea. And by family, I mean really close family, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces, cousins, second cousins. You get the picture. Let's start with Charles II of Spain, who earned the dubious distinction of being called the Bewitched. He had every possible Habsburg feature packed into one person, which mostly meant an enormous jaw, weak limbs, and a general appearance that made people whisper politely and then avert their eyes. He was also extremely frail, sickly, and, well, not particularly bright. He inherited all this not because anyone was cruel, but because his ancestors were diligent about marrying relatives. A cousin here, an aunt there, a nephew somewhere else. It was all in the service of keeping power and land consolidated. But nature, as it tends to, did not cooperate. Charles spent most of his life in discomfort, plagued by health problems, and apparently had difficulty even walking without support. He reigned for over 3 decades, which is impressive given his physical state, but he never had children to continue the Habsburg line. So the whole careful genetic planning kind of fizzled. Now, if Charles seems extreme, then his relatives on the Spanish throne are worth a gentle gaze too. Take Philip IV, his father, who also had a bit of the Habsburg jaw action, though he somehow managed to sire many children, most of whom were themselves riddled with minor health issues. The pattern is easy to spot: a tendency to overbite, weak musculature, and fragile constitutions. Of course, the court doctors must have been frustrated beyond measure, making endless lists of remedies and potions for ailments that were essentially hardwired into the family tree. If we drift slightly westward, Louis XIV of France pops up, the Sun King, who ruled in a much more theatrical, extravagant style. He was called the Sun King because he wanted everything to revolve around him: gardens, courtiers, policies. But in private life, he had a slightly obsessive approach to marriage and children. He and his queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, produced many offspring, but several died young, and some were clearly not built for the kind of vigorous royal duties expected of them. The irony is, Louis was obsessed with appearances, protocol, and legacy. Yet the genetics he passed along sometimes had other plans, quietly undermining his carefully staged grandeur. Let's drift north for a moment to the British Isles, where similar patterns emerge. Charles II of England, no relation to the Spanish Habsburg, but an interesting contrast, spent most of his life trying to survive political upheaval rather than biological complications. However, the Stuart dynasty had its own quirks, particularly when it came to marrying for politics rather than health. Multiple consanguineous unions produced delicate heirs and a fair amount of court gossip, though not quite the structural genetic collapse seen in Spain. The subtler tragedies of weak or sickly children haunted royal families everywhere, sometimes ignored in official portraits, but very present in the bedrooms and nurseries of palaces. Back to continental Europe. Let's drift lazily to the Austro-Hungarian territories where Maria Theresa ruled. She was a strong-willed woman who managed to have 16 children, which sounds exhausting even by today's standards. She tried, as any good ruler would, to marry them off strategically. Some unions were brilliant politically, others less so, especially when they involved close cousins. The inbreeding tendencies of European royalty often meant that her descendants, though powerful, carried the same quirks, frailties, and occasional jaw anomalies as her Habsburg cousins. There's a quiet melancholy in realizing that political strategy often came at the cost of healthy, happy children. And while we float through these corridors of history, we see that these patterns weren't accidents, they were choices, often rational within the framework of dynastic politics, yet tragic in human terms. The more you look, the more you notice tiny repeated gestures. A limp here, a weak heart there, a child who dies too early, a noble spouse who is both loving and subtly terrified of the next generation. Each generation carried forward a legacy of fragility hidden beneath silk robes, jeweled crowns, and elaborate state ceremonies. Let's pause just enough to notice the subtle humor in it. These monarchs were often described as heroic or magnificent in portraits, yet the reality was sometimes a bit less impressive. They could command armies and empires, dictate laws, and arrange marriages like chess pieces, and still struggle to chew food properly or walk unassisted. It's a gentle reminder that no matter the power, everyone has limits, and history sometimes takes those limits and turns them into long, slow, almost poetic tragedies of the flesh. And speaking of subtle tragedies wrapped in velvet and gold, we can drift over to the earlier Habsburgs of the 16th century. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was a fascinating specimen in his own right, though not as physically compromised as some of his descendants. He had this knack for inheriting vast lands without really thinking about the human consequences. He could control Spain, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and the Americas, which is impressive, but he also inherited the family tendency toward narrow jaws and somewhat fragile constitutions. It didn't stop him from political domination, of course, but it's worth noting that his children would carry both the glory and the subtle weaknesses of his lineage. His son, Philip II of Spain, leaned heavily into the pattern. He married 4 times, carefully selecting brides within the European royal network, and while these marriages strengthened political alliances, they also reinforced genetic tendencies that would become more noticeable in subsequent generations. Philip's children had varying levels of health, some quite robust, others remarkably delicate. It's almost as if the family line itself was a slow experiment in controlled fragility, with each generation testing the limits of inherited traits. Meanwhile, over in France, Henry II had married Catherine de' Medici, another example of calculated political union. Catherine herself was Italian, bringing her own lineage of complex familial traits into the French royal mix. Their children, especially the 3 sons who successively became kings, were notorious for their eccentricities, illnesses, and, in some cases, tragic early deaths. Francis II, the eldest, reigned briefly and succumbed young, leaving little room for dynastic stability. Charles IX, the second son, presided over France riven with religious strife and died of tuberculosis, fragile like many of his ancestors. And then Henry III, the youngest, who survived a little longer, had his own psychological quirks and was described as highly neurotic, almost certainly a byproduct of a lifetime of palace pressures and inherited weaknesses. The family was magnificent, powerful, and endlessly fascinating, but also quietly, persistently fragile. Turning eastward again, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth provides another window into this delicate dance of power and genetics. Sigismund III Vasa, who held both Polish and Swedish crowns, married within tight royal circles. Again, partly for politics and partly because the concept of outsiders marrying in was still somewhat scandalous in courtly thinking. His descendants displayed a mixture of brilliance and frailty, though the historical records are less detailed about their physical oddities. The pattern of intermarriage clearly left its subtle mark. You can almost feel the slow, inevitable pull of genetics across the generations. A stiff posture here, a minor deformity there, a series of weak heirs who never quite met the grand expectations of the thrones. Of course, while discussing these monarchs, it's tempting to glance at the English Tudors again, but focusing more on the private lives, less on wars. Henry VIII is infamous for his 6 marriages and dramatic divorces, yet the real fascination is in his children and their fates. Edward VI, frail and sickly, ruled briefly and passed away before reaching adulthood. Mary I, known for her stern demeanor, struggled to project both authority and health, facing recurring illnesses that may have been partly hereditary. Elizabeth I, on the other hand, survived against all odds and remained physically robust, though historians still debate how much her single-minded focus and cautious political maneuvering contributed to her longevity. Even in a line that managed to avoid the extreme inbreeding of some continental houses, the pattern of fragility and delicate health is visible, shaped by a mixture of genetics and circumstance. Meanwhile, back in the Habsburg lands, the story of Maria Anna of Spain and her descendants continues to unfold. She married Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor, producing children who, like many of their ancestors, were highly sensitive, prone to illness, and often more remarkable for their intellect than for robust physical health. Many of these children were thrust into political marriages themselves, with a cycle of carefully chosen relatives, fragile health, and occasional eccentricity repeated. It's striking how consistent the pattern becomes when viewed over a century or more. Power consolidated through kinship, families tied together by contracts and coronets, and children carrying forward not just the titles, but the quiet burdens of inherited weakness. Let's float south for a moment to Portugal, where John IV, the founder of the Braganza dynasty, married closely within noble circles to secure alliances. His descendants, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, displayed a mixture of charm and fragility. Some children thrived, others succumbed to illnesses that today might seem minor but were deadly then. The meticulous political strategy of marrying within familiar families may have seemed wise in terms of consolidating power, yet it consistently produced a generation or two of delicate heirs whose lives were often shorter or more troubled than hoped. In Scandinavia, dynasties like the Oldenburgs followed a similar pattern. Danish and Norwegian royals often married cousins or close kin, aiming to cement alliances and prevent outside influence. The consequences were subtle but observable: slightly weakened constitutions, sometimes eccentric behavior, or children with minor physical anomalies. These traits rarely made headlines beyond the palace, but in hindsight, they form a quiet rhythm running through the fabric of European nobility. You start to notice that fragility, eccentricity, and early deaths are as much a part of history as battles, treaties, or coronations. Of course, not all dynasties were so dramatically afflicted. Some lines managed to balance intermarriage with relative health, producing heirs who could survive the pressures of throne and family alike. But even here, the human tendency to repeat patterns in pursuit of political stability is clear. Monarchs obsessed with preserving bloodlines often overlooked the subtle warning signs in the children they raised, and history quietly bears witness to these choices through portraits, letters, and the occasional diary entry noting a limp, a cough, or a strange habit. We can drift lazily into the 18th century, where the Bourbon kings of France continued the tradition of dynastic marriages with varying results. Louis XV, who ruled for decades, produced children with a mixture of vigor and weakness. Some were robust and clever, others were plagued by illness, and a few had the sort of eccentricities that courtiers and contemporaries wrote about in hushed tones. It's easy to imagine these royal children moving through enormous palaces, watched over by tutors and governesses, carrying the weight of family expectation while occasionally succumbing to the quiet burdens of hereditary frailty. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs of Austria continued to exemplify what might politely be called selective breeding, gone a little too far. Leopold I, Joseph I, and Charles VI each married within a relatively tight network of European nobility. Their children displayed minor to moderate physical and mental fragilities, but the political payoff, in terms of consolidating alliances and claims, was undeniable. It's a gentle reminder that historical decisions about marriage and succession were rarely made with personal health in mind. Political calculations usually outweighed concerns about whether the next generation would be able to walk, speak clearly, or survive infancy. Then there is the quiet story of the smaller German principalities, each with its own collection of dukes, counts, and princes carefully marrying within the same circles to preserve land and title. Some children thrived, some struggled, but the overall pattern mirrors the larger European dynasties. Delicate heirs, subtle physical quirks, and the succession of quiet tragedies in the nurseries and private chambers that rarely made it into the public record. And as we wander slowly through these dynasties, the human dimension becomes clear. The kings and queens, princes and princesses were more than political symbols. They were children, often sickly or peculiar, who grew up in palaces filled with wealth and expectation but limited freedom. They suffered quietly, as their parents and tutors tried to mold them into heirs capable of continuing dynastic legacies. The tension between grandeur and fragility, ambition and human limitation repeats across centuries in a rhythm that is both fascinating and gently melancholic. By the 19th century, the trend continued, though slightly mitigated by advances in medicine and slightly broader marriage networks. The Spanish Bourbons, Austrian Habsburgs, and smaller German houses still married within restricted circles, producing heirs with varying levels of robustness. Some children were fortunate, living long, politically capable lives. Others continued to struggle with inherited weaknesses, their personal challenges quietly noted in letters or medical records. The pattern is unmistakable. Dynastic ambition and political strategy often outweighed personal health considerations, leaving a trail of quietly fragile lives intertwined with the grand narrative of European history. Moving further into the 17th and 18th centuries, we encounter the fascinatingly fragile world of the Habsburgs yet again, now through the lens of Emperor Charles VI and his children. Charles VI, a man with a rather stiff disposition and an unremarkable physique compared to some of his predecessors, was married to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a woman of patience and quiet fortitude, which she needed in ample supply. Their children, predictably, were a mixed bag, ranging from lively yet delicate daughters to sons whose health often demanded constant attention. Maria Theresa, the most famous of their children, managed to defy many of the physical frailties of her line, though she was by no means immune to the subtle pressures of inherited weaknesses. Her life, like many of her siblings, illustrates the recurring pattern: vast power, careful dynastic marriages, and children who were born into wealth and expectation, yet often physically fragile or unusually delicate. Maria Theresa herself married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a man who, while less physically compromised than the average Habsburg male, was nonetheless subject to the relentless courtly pressures and inherited tendencies toward nervousness and sensitivity Their offspring, 14 in total, present a veritable catalogue of aristocratic idiosyncrasies. Some daughters, like Marie Antoinette, would rise to fame and fortune only to meet tragic fates shaped partly by circumstance and partly by inherited temperament. Others lived quieter lives, quietly contending with minor health issues or peculiar personalities, forming the understated human backdrop to the political and military grandeur of their era. If we float slightly northward, the Scandinavian courts provide a similar, if subtler, narrative of fragile heirs and dynastic continuity. The Oldenburg kings, particularly in Denmark, often married within their own circles or with German princely houses. Christian VI, for instance, had children whose health varied widely, with some succumbing to minor illnesses that today would barely merit attention. Yet, in the context of 18th century Europe, even a mild fever could have long lasting consequences, especially for heirs expected to continue dynastic lines. The repetition of selective inbreeding across generations quietly shaped the personality, health, and behavior of these royal children, often leaving them slightly eccentric, nervously sensitive, or constitutionally delicate. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbon family saga continued to showcase the same patterns of carefully orchestrated marriages combined with inherited fragility. Louis XV, long reigning and often criticized for indulgence, produced children who displayed a mixture of vitality and frailty. The Dauphin, for instance, though expected to inherit robust health and strong character, suffered from intermittent illnesses and never reached his father's age. His children, in turn, would inherit the same mixture of charm, intelligence, and physical delicacy. It's a recurring theme in these dynasties. Political calculations dictated marriage, but biology dictated the subtler consequences, which often manifested in quiet suffering behind the gilded facades of palaces. Traveling west, the Iberian Peninsula offers another example. Charles II of Spain, famously nicknamed the Bewitched due to his extreme physical and mental fragility, was the product of generations of intermarriage within the Habsburg family. His jaw, a notorious example of the family's inbreeding, and his delicate constitution made him one of the most emblematic cases of dynastic fragility. Despite being king, Charles II could not father an heir, leaving Spain on the brink of succession crisis and eventual conflict. His life was quietly tragic, marked by medical attentions, personal restrictions, and the heavy weight of expectation from a lineage that had slowly undermined its own physical robustness. Meanwhile, the smaller German and Italian principalities provide endless examples of delicate heirs raised amid ceremonial grandeur. In Bavaria, the Wittelsbachs continued a tradition of cautious marital alliances, producing children who were often healthy enough to survive childhood but delicate enough to require continuous care. Similarly, in the various Italian duchies, children of the Farnese, Medici, and Savoy families frequently exhibited minor physical anomalies or health concerns, quietly shaping their behavior and courtly interactions. It's a subtle rhythm in history: grand palaces and powerful titles on the surface, fragile humans beneath, delicately negotiating inheritance, expectation, and personal health. Returning to Austria, we see that Maria Theresa's descendants continued to manifest the subtle traces of inherited fragility, though by careful marriage strategies they mitigated the worst extremes of inbreeding. Her daughters married into various European courts. Saxony, Naples, France carried with them the combined legacy of Habsburg resilience and delicate constitution. Some thrived, some struggled, but all bore the invisible weight of dynastic expectation, living lives that were as much about maintaining appearances and alliances as about personal health and well-being. The Bourbon family in Spain, parallel to these developments, faced similar issues. Charles III, for instance, produced children whose health varied, some unusually robust, others delicate, reflecting the unpredictable outcomes of dynastic strategy combined with heredity. The lessons here are subtle. Even careful genetic planning could not entirely mitigate the slow, quiet influence of inherited fragility, and history leaves these human stories faintly visible amidst the more overt narratives of wars and political machinations. In the Russian Empire, the Romanovs present another fascinating set of examples. Peter the Great's descendants, particularly during the 18th century, displayed varying degrees of robustness and vulnerability. Some children, like Elizabeth Petrovna, survived to rule effectively, while others succumbed to illness or displayed behavioral eccentricities that would today be noted by psychologists or genealogists. The intermarriage patterns within the Russian nobility, often including German and Scandinavian princesses, shaped the delicate balance of health, temperament, and political capability among the next generation. Meanwhile, over in Prussia, Frederick the Great maintained a careful balance between dynastic continuity and personal health considerations, though his own siblings displayed the range of physical and psychological fragilities common in European royal houses. His nephews and nieces continued these patterns, often under the gaze of attentive tutors, guardians, and court physicians, highlighting the persistent interplay between power, expectation, and human limitation. Across Europe, the 18th century in particular demonstrates this fascinating tension. Monarchs and aristocrats pursued carefully orchestrated marriages to consolidate power, sometimes ignoring subtle genetic consequences. The children born into these households inherited wealth, prestige, and titles, but often also fragile constitutions, minor deformities, or eccentric temperaments. They moved through palaces with tutors and governesses, carrying the dual burden of political expectation and inherited vulnerability, all while the courts of Europe continued their ceremonial dance of diplomacy, alliance, and subtle rivalry. Even the smaller principalities of Italy, Germany, and Scandinavia showed the same quiet patterns. The Medici, the Wittelsbach, the Oldenburgs each produced heirs with slightly unusual physiques, minor health concerns, or nervous dispositions. These traits were rarely dramatic but consistently present, forming a subtle undercurrent beneath the grandeur of European dynastic politics. You begin to see history not as a series of battles and treaties, but as a rhythm of human fragility, quietly shaping the succession of power over generations. As we move into the late 18th century, Maria Theresa's grandchildren, the younger generation of Habsburgs, Bourbon heirs in France and Spain, and various German dukes, all illustrate similar themes. Some children were vigorous and lively, able to meet the expectations of palace and country. Others were delicate, introspective, or slightly eccentric, requiring careful attention and the constant presence of governesses, tutors, and physicians. It's a gentle reminder that behind the velvet, gold, and ceremonial splendor of European courts lay generations of fragile humans quietly navigating inherited vulnerabilities and the expectations of dynastic continuity. The repetition of these patterns is striking across countries, centuries, and dynasties. The interplay of selective marriage, inherited fragility, and courtly expectation repeats. Minor illnesses, delicate temperaments, and occasionally bizarre behaviors appear as quietly recurring motifs just beneath the surface of formal history. Each generation inherits not only wealth and titles, but subtle limitations shaped by biology and circumstance, making every royal nursery a laboratory of human fragility and dynastic continuity. In Spain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and beyond, these patterns create a kind of historical rhythm: birth, expectation, fragility, cautious care, and the sometimes tragic but mostly understated consequences of generations shaped by power and marriage strategy. The children of monarchs were rarely free to live natural lives. Their every movement and health concern recorded, monitored, and shaped by the invisible hand of dynastic necessity. Some survived brilliantly, others quietly failed, leaving behind letters, portraits, and medical notes as faint whispers of their existence. It is perhaps in this quiet, often overlooked dimension of history that we see the true human cost of monarchy. Power, wealth, and political dominance are visible and easily chronicled, but the delicate lives of the children, those who inherit both titles and vulnerabilities, offer a subtler, more poignant narrative. We see the repetition of fragile constitutions, nervous dispositions, and minor physical anomalies, all quietly shaping European history beneath the visible surface of conquest, alliance, and ceremony. As we glide gently into the late 18th century, the fragile web of European dynasties becomes ever more apparent, particularly when examining the children of the Bourbon and Habsburg families. Marie Antoinette, the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa, now emerges as a particularly vivid example of inherited fragility mixed with resilience, a princess whose life was quietly shaped by centuries of dynastic patterns. Born into the grandeur of the Viennese court, she was delicate from the start, prone to minor illnesses and easily fatigued, yet endowed with a charm and liveliness that allowed her to survive the endless scrutiny of tutors, etiquette masters, and family physicians. Her upbringing was a careful balance of strict regimen and indulgent attention, a paradoxical attempt to prepare a young girl for the impossible role of queen while simultaneously preserving her health and disposition. Her marriage into the French Bourbon family illustrates another recurring theme: the collision between inherited fragility and political expectation. Louis XVI, her husband, was himself a product of careful dynastic planning, his constitution slightly delicate, his temperament gentle, and his nervous system particularly sensitive to the pressures of court life. Their children, therefore, carried the subtle imprint of 2 centuries of European inbreeding and aristocratic management, with health and temperament always precariously balanced against the demands of succession and ceremony. The eldest, Marie Therese, inherited a certain nervous energy from both parents, often pale and subdued, yet capable of moments of surprising vitality. Her siblings varied, with some children showing more physical delicacy and others more resilience, but all moved within the invisible framework of dynastic expectation, monitored by physicians and governesses who carefully recorded every sneeze, pallor, or sign of fatigue. Meanwhile, across the Alps, the Habsburgs continued to provide a rich tapestry of delicate children navigating immense power. Leopold II, Maria Theresa's son, fathered children whose health and temperament varied subtly across the spectrum, some robust and politically capable, others more inclined toward nervousness and minor physical vulnerability. These children, although heirs to enormous estates and titles, often struggled with mundane health issues that today might seem trivial, but in the context of their time demanded constant attention and could even influence succession decisions. Their lives demonstrate the quiet rhythm of dynastic fragility, health, temperament, and expectation, all entwined in a delicate, almost imperceptible dance beneath the gilded surface of European palaces. In Portugal, The House of Braganza produced a similar array of delicate heirs, with children carefully nurtured, often medically supervised, and surrounded by tutors who balanced lessons in politics, etiquette, and health management. The Portuguese court, smaller and quieter than Versailles or Vienna, still reflected the same patterns. Children born into wealth and power, yet whose constitutions and temperaments bore the subtle imprint of dynastic intermarriage and inherited fragility. By the late 18th century, the cumulative effects of such practices had become increasingly visible. Minor deformities, unusually sensitive nerves, and temperamental eccentricities peppered the generation, quietly shaping alliances, marriage negotiations, and even the occasional succession crisis. In Prussia, the Hohenzollerns' children displayed a more disciplined approach to health and upbringing, often emphasizing physical training, structured education, and controlled diet. Still, even within these militarized and regimented households, inherited fragilities surfaced. Frederick William II, for instance, struggled with a slightly delicate constitution, as did several of his children. Court physicians and attendants were ever vigilant, noting small changes in complexion, mood, or appetite that could signify more serious underlying issues. These children, though outwardly appearing to thrive, were subtly guided through a life of expectation and limitation, the invisible hand of dynastic caution, shaping not only their education but their very bodies and nerves. Russia's Romanovs, similarly, carried the imprint of generations of dynastic alliances with German and Scandinavian nobility. Paul Wurst, though physically imposing in some ways, inherited tendencies toward nervous tension and obsessive attention to ceremonial details, traits which he, in turn, passed to his children. The young Alexander I and his siblings displayed a range of delicate traits, minor physical vulnerabilities, highly sensitive temperaments, and moments of deep introspection or sudden melancholy. These were children born into immense power, but whose inherited fragilities required constant management and careful observation, further emphasizing the recurring theme across European courts: wealth and title cannot entirely shield one from the subtle consequences of heredity. Meanwhile, in the smaller German principalities, the same pattern repeats. The Dukes of Brunswick, Mecklenburg, and Saxony produced children who were physically delicate, often prone to minor illnesses or nervous dispositions. These children moved through palaces with tutors and governesses, their every action and health status quietly observed and recorded. Even in seemingly minor courts, the intermarriage strategies of European dynasties left their mark. Minor physical oddities, sensitive constitutions, and occasional eccentricities appeared as quietly recurring motifs, shaping dynastic alliances and daily life with subtle but persistent influence. Back in Austria, the next generation of Habsburgs continued this delicate pattern. Francis II, later Emperor of Austria, oversaw children whose physical and emotional delicacy reflected centuries of dynastic pressures. Some were unusually sensitive to stress, others prone to minor illnesses, yet all were carefully nurtured to carry the Habsburg line forward. Their lives demonstrate the enduring tension between power, inheritance, and fragility. The children who inherit vast estates and titles are simultaneously burdened with inherited vulnerability, a theme quietly repeating across centuries of European monarchy. In Spain, the Bourbon children of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma further exemplify this intersection of political expectation and fragile heredity. Their offspring displayed a spectrum of health and temperament, some resilient enough to manage court life, others prone to nervous disorders or delicate constitutions. These characteristics were not dramatic but consistently present, shaping social interactions, educational strategies, and succession planning. The quiet repetition of these traits underscores a fundamental pattern. Dynastic ambition often exacts subtle but persistent human costs, manifesting in the children who inherit not only titles but inherited vulnerability. The Italian duchies, Savoy, Modena, Parma, and Tuscany offer a microcosm of these European patterns. Children were raised amid careful monitoring, extensive medical attention, and structured upbringing. Minor health anomalies, nervous dispositions, and subtle physical fragilities appeared repeatedly, quietly shaping not only individual lives but the political alliances they carried into marriage. Even in smaller courts, where political stakes were less grandiose, these inherited traits demonstrated the pervasive influence of dynastic strategy on human biology and temperament. Returning to France, the offspring of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette reflect both the triumphs and quiet tragedies of dynastic planning. Their eldest daughter, Marie-Thérèse, displayed delicate health and refined temperament, shaped by both inherited fragility and the pressures of royal expectation. Her siblings varied. Some displayed more vigor, others more susceptibility to illness or mood fluctuations. Each child's life illustrates the careful balance between expectation and vulnerability, a pattern repeated across European royalty and quietly shaping the next generation of political actors. The late 18th and early 19th centuries in Europe thus present a rich panorama of dynastic fragility. Across courts, palaces, and duchies, children were born into immense privilege, yet quietly burdened by inherited delicacy. Minor illnesses, nervous temperaments, and subtle physical anomalies punctuated the lives of the heirs, forming a rhythm beneath the visible grandeur of monarchy. These patterns repeat in Austria, France, Spain, Prussia, Russia, and the smaller German and Italian states, emphasizing the persistent tension between political expectation, inherited fragility, and the human cost of dynastic continuity. Even as Europe moved toward the upheavals of the Napoleonic era, the lives of these children remained remarkably consistent in their quiet fragility. Palaces continued to nurture them, tutors and governesses guided their education, physicians monitored their health, and marriages were carefully orchestrated to preserve alliances and dynastic stability. Yet beneath the ceremonial surface, these children experienced the subtle consequences of inherited constitution and temperament, navigating the delicate intersection of power, expectation, and human limitation. By the early 19th century, Europe's royal children continued to embody the quiet tensions of dynastic inheritance. In the Austrian Empire, Francis II's children presented a particularly fascinating mix of inherited fragility and carefully cultivated talent. Ferdinand I, the eldest surviving son, was famously delicate, prone to fainting spells, and sensitive to both illness and the emotional turbulence of the court. His siblings, while slightly more robust, carried similar vulnerabilities, subtle nervous disorders, minor physical anomalies, and a temperament shaped as much by inherited predispositions as by the strictures of palace life. Tutors, governesses, and physicians kept meticulous records of every symptom, every slight change in complexion or appetite, because in these dynasties, even the smallest irregularity could ripple outward into political or marital consequences. Meanwhile, across the German principalities, the pattern persisted. The ducal families of Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg were often smaller in scale but no less invested in the careful cultivation of their heirs. Children were introduced early to regimented education and limited physical activity designed to maintain health without overtaxing fragile constitutions. Yet, despite careful management, minor deformities, delicate nerves, and eccentricities regularly appeared. Prince Maximilian of Bavaria, for instance, grew into adulthood with a slight stoop and a nervous disposition, traits that reflected both his upbringing and centuries of inbreeding that subtly influenced his body and temperament. These traits, though unremarkable to outsiders, were endlessly discussed in private correspondence and subtly influenced marriage prospects, alliances, and expectations of leadership. In Russia, Alexander I and Nicholas I, both products of the Romanov line, were surrounded by similar attentiveness. Alexander's introspective temperament and occasional melancholy hinted at inherited nervous tendencies, while Nicholas's careful, calculating personality was partially shaped by a constitution that required close monitoring and protection from both physical and emotional strain. Their siblings, too, displayed a range of delicate features, minor health anomalies, sensitive nerves, and an inclination toward introspection or sudden mood shifts. The Romanov children of this era were carefully guided through the minutiae of court etiquette, education, and ceremonial practice, yet each bore the subtle imprint of inherited fragility that quietly shaped their behavior, decision-making, and interactions with court society. Back in France, the Bourbon children of the post-revolutionary period were subjected to a curious combination of inherited fragility and political expectation. Louis XVIII and Charles X, though adults by the time of the Restoration, had siblings whose lives illustrate the persistent interplay of delicate constitutions and dynastic planning. The younger children of the pre-revolutionary Bourbons often suffered minor health issues, fragile nerves, and a general predisposition to melancholy. These traits were carefully documented by physicians who recorded every sneeze, pallor, or nervous tic, understanding that even small physical or emotional irregularities could influence the political and social positioning of the family. The Restoration Court, though constrained by political upheaval, maintained these meticulous habits, reinforcing the pattern of careful observation, attention to inherited fragility, and dynastic management. Spain, too, exhibited similar patterns among its royal children. Ferdinand VII, his siblings, and their cousins were prone to minor illnesses, sensitive temperaments, and occasional nervous disorders. Even the youngest children, often cherished for their innocence and potential, displayed subtle physical or emotional vulnerabilities that required constant attention. The Spanish court, influenced by centuries of Habsburg and Bourbon intermarriage, reflected the cumulative effects of dynastic planning on both body and mind. These children, while outwardly royal and privileged, were quietly shaped by inherited traits, with physicians and tutors meticulously guiding their lives to maintain health, temperament, and political suitability. Italy's smaller duchies continued to produce children marked by delicate constitutions and eccentric tendencies. The House of Savoy, for instance, was known for children whose physical and emotional fragility demanded constant supervision. Minor deformities, delicate nerves, and subtle idiosyncrasies appeared repeatedly across generations, shaping not only personal development but also marriage alliances and political relationships. In Modena, Parma, and Tuscany, similar patterns emerged. Children carefully nurtured, closely monitored, and guided through a regimented upbringing designed to maintain both health and suitability for dynastic responsibility. The subtle interplay between inherited fragility and political expectation created a quiet rhythm in daily life, observable to those within the court but imperceptible to the outside world. In Prussia, the Hohenzollern children exhibited a slightly different pattern, blending inherited delicacy with rigorous physical and educational regimens. Frederick William III's offspring were carefully raised with an emphasis on controlled exercise, strict diet, and disciplined education, yet inherited nervous tendencies persisted. The young princes and princesses often displayed minor health anomalies, sensitive constitutions, and a reserved temperament. Their upbringing reflected a continuous balancing act, cultivate strength and political acumen while protecting fragile bodies and nerves, a theme that had quietly persisted across European dynasties for centuries. The Scandinavian monarchies, particularly Denmark and Sweden, contributed another layer to this tapestry of delicate heirs. Children of these northern courts were often robust compared to their southern cousins, but still exhibited subtle fragilities, particularly when dynastic marriages introduced genetic vulnerabilities. Minor deformities, sensitive nerves, and occasional eccentricities were carefully observed by tutors and physicians, and even these subtle traits could influence alliances, succession, and courtly relationships. The quiet, structured upbringing of Scandinavian royal children mirrored patterns seen across the continent. A constant, gentle management of fragility amidst inherited expectations of power. By the mid-19th century, the pattern of delicate, closely observed children had spread across nearly every European monarchy. Even when political upheaval or social reform challenged the outward expression of royal power, the private lives of heirs remained steeped in centuries of inherited fragility and dynastic expectation. Children moved through palaces with tutors, governesses, and physicians, their every sneeze, pallor, or mood fluctuation quietly recorded and analyzed. Minor physical anomalies, sensitive temperaments, and subtle eccentricities punctuated their development, forming a consistent, almost imperceptible pattern that shaped alliances, marriages, and succession planning. In Austria, Francis Joseph I's children continued this tradition, showing a mixture of physical delicacy and subtle nervous tendencies. Emperor Franz Joseph's attentiveness to their health, education, and temperament reflected both paternal concern and centuries of dynastic practice. The young archdukes and archduchesses displayed the recurring traits of minor illness, nervous disposition, and temperamentally sensitive behavior, which influenced not only their personal development but also the expectations of the court. Each child's life, carefully documented and managed, illustrates the quiet repetition of dynastic fragility across centuries. Prussia's later Hohenzollern children, particularly those of Wilhelm I and Frederick III, continued this blend of delicate constitution and regimented upbringing. Physicians, tutors, and attendants maintained meticulous records of every minor health irregularity, understanding the importance of both physical and emotional stability for future rulers. Nervous dispositions, minor deformities, and occasional eccentricities were treated with calm attention, with the goal of producing heirs capable of managing both courtly expectation and statecraft despite inherent fragility. These patterns quietly shaped alliances, marriage negotiations, and the social atmosphere of the court, illustrating the persistent influence of dynastic inheritance on the human body and temperament. Across the smaller German states Hesse, Nassau, Baden, and Württemberg, the lives of children reflected a similar quiet fragility. Physical delicacy, sensitive temperament, and subtle eccentricities were carefully monitored by tutors and physicians. Even when political stakes were comparatively minor, The influence of inherited traits on marriage alliances, courtly relationships, and social standing remained significant. These children, like their peers in larger courts, moved through a delicate world of expectation and fragility, their lives shaped by centuries of dynastic planning and careful observation. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Bourbon children of Portugal and Spain continued to reflect inherited delicacy and subtle eccentricity. Minor health anomalies, nervous dispositions, and subtle temperament variations appeared regularly, quietly influencing the management of the court and the expectations placed upon each child. Tutors, governesses, and physicians monitored every development, balancing indulgence with discipline to ensure that children would survive the pressures of royal life while retaining the physical and emotional composure necessary for dynastic continuity. Russia's Romanovs of this era, particularly Nicholas I and Alexander II, demonstrated the same subtle pattern of inherited fragility. Children displayed delicate constitutions, sensitive nerves, and occasional temperamentally driven eccentricities. Physicians and tutors guided their development carefully, balancing education, physical activity, and social exposure to produce heirs capable of navigating the demands of empire despite inherent vulnerabilities. The quiet repetition of these patterns across centuries and continents illustrates the persistent influence of inherited constitution on dynastic life. By the late 19th century, European royal children had become both heirs and symbols, fragile vessels carrying centuries of dynastic expectation. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Emperor Franz Joseph's numerous nieces and nephews moved through palaces with a quiet, almost ceremonial delicacy. Minor illnesses were met with gentle fussing. Slight pallor prompted immediate attention. A fainting spell could summon a physician, a governess, and a concerned aunt all at once. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, though known later for his adult decisiveness, displayed in youth a nervous attentiveness to detail, an inherited propensity for careful observation, and a constitution that occasionally balked under minor exertion. His cousins, various archduchesses, were equally delicate, one prone to migraines, another to fainting at social gatherings, and another still to sudden bursts of shyness that could last days. These were not dramatic maladies. They were subtle, almost invisible ripples of inherited fragility, quietly shaping personality, preference, and social navigation. In the German Empire, the children of Wilhelm II displayed a curious mixture of inherited nervousness and cultivated propriety. Kaiser Wilhelm's own early life had been characterized by strict supervision, regimented education, and frequent medical checkups, and he transmitted similar expectations to his children. The young princes and princesses, though outwardly playful, were subject to careful observation. Posture, appetite, mood, and even the cadence of their speech were noted and corrected. Minor tremors, fleeting episodes of melancholy, or unusual timidity were met with quiet concern and disciplined management. These children grew into a world of heightened expectation, where even the smallest physical or emotional quirk could influence future marriages, alliances, or succession politics. The British royal children of Victoria's era were similarly shaped, though in a slightly less physically constrained environment. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's offspring were educated rigorously, their health carefully tended, and their personalities monitored closely. Yet inherited traits persisted. Prince Arthur had a persistent but minor speech impediment and a tendency towards sensitive introspection, while Princess Alice displayed recurrent nervous exhaustion that required rest periods and careful pacing of her social engagements. The intricate web of marriage alliances throughout Europe meant that even minor physical or emotional anomalies were considered in the broader dynastic calculus, subtly influencing decisions about education, upbringing, and courtly presentation. In Italy, the Savoy children navigated the delicate balance between fragile health and dynastic expectation with characteristic quiet resilience. Minor illnesses, sensitive nerves, and subtle eccentricities punctuated daily life in the palaces of Turin and Naples. Even as Italy moved toward unification, these children remained tied to a rhythm centuries in the making: careful attention to health, constant monitoring of temperament, and a subtle awareness that every bodily quirk might affect alliances, political standing, or marriage negotiations. The Spanish Bourbons maintained their quiet pattern of delicacy and careful upbringing. Alfonso XII and his siblings, though outwardly active and charming, were closely watched for minor health irregularities and signs of temperamentally induced stress. Pallor, fatigue, or slight anxiety could summon the intervention of a physician or governess, ensuring that children remained both physically stable and socially presentable. Inherited fragility, often subtle, often invisible to casual observers, continued to guide behavior, expectations, and the broader social positioning of these young royals. In Russia, the Romanov children exhibited a continuation of centuries-long patterns. Nicholas II's offspring, the Tsarevich Alexei and his sisters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, were delicate in body and temperament. Alexei, with his hemophilia, required constant attention. Even minor cuts or bruises could become serious. The girls, while healthy compared to their brother, displayed inherited tendencies toward nervousness and emotional sensitivity. Every cough, slight pallor, or sudden burst of fatigue prompted immediate care. Physicians and tutors meticulously recorded each development, balancing care with the need to cultivate social grace and political awareness. The quiet repetition of dynastic fragility combined with political expectation shaped their lives in ways both visible and invisible. The smaller German principalities continued to produce children marked by subtle fragility and careful upbringing. In Hesse, Baden, and Mecklenburg, minor deformities, delicate constitutions, and sensitive nerves were monitored closely. Even seemingly trivial physical quirks, slight stoops, unusual gait, or timid social behavior were noted in correspondence, diaries, and medical logs. These observations influenced not only upbringing but marriage negotiations, alliances, and succession planning, reinforcing the quiet interplay between inherited physical and emotional traits and the broader structure of dynastic expectation. In Scandinavia, royal children were comparatively more robust physically but still bore subtle traces of inherited fragility. The Danish and Swedish courts monitored minor anomalies carefully. Small speech peculiarities, nervous tendencies, or fleeting illness episodes were observed, documented, and addressed. These children, moving through palaces with structured routines of education, physical exercise, and socialization, carried forward centuries of inherited traits in a quiet, almost imperceptible rhythm. Each generation maintained a continuity of delicate constitution and subtle eccentricity, linking past to present with gentle precision. Austria, Prussia, and the Russian Empire together formed a remarkable triad of dynastic fragility and meticulous upbringing. Across these courts, children moved through regimented schedules, guided by tutors, governesses, and physicians who monitored the minutiae of health and temperament. Inherited traits, minor physical anomalies, sensitive nerves, fleeting emotional instability were noted, understood, and managed. These subtle patterns influenced alliances, education, and succession planning, ensuring that the fragile children of Europe's royal houses were simultaneously heirs, symbols, and carefully guided instruments of dynastic continuity. The interweaving of inheritance, fragility, and expectation became particularly visible in marriage negotiations. Across Europe, royal families sought to match heirs not only by political advantage, but also by compatible physical and emotional traits. A minor nervous tendency in one child could influence an alliance. A slight pallor in another might delay a betrothal. Physicians' notes, tutors' observations, and letters between courts carefully documented the subtleties of each child's constitution and temperament, creating a web of quiet influence that shaped the political and social landscape. Even the most minor health anomaly or slight eccentricity could ripple outward, subtly guiding decisions that affected empires and dynasties. In France, the Orleans children of the late 19th century embodied a blend of inherited fragility and careful social grooming. Louis Philippe's descendants displayed subtle nervous tendencies, minor physical vulnerabilities, and occasional eccentricities. The Restoration and later political upheavals had not eliminated the patterns established over centuries. Children were carefully observed, educated, and groomed with attention paid to even minor emotional fluctuations or physical peculiarities. Tutors and physicians ensured that the children remained both socially adept and physically stable, continuing the quiet, centuries long pattern of dynastic management. Italy's post unification royal children, particularly the Savoy princes and princesses, exhibited similar characteristics. Minor health issues, delicate nerves, and subtle eccentricities were carefully managed. Even when political pressures demanded a strong public image, the children's private lives remained meticulously controlled. Physicians, tutors, and attendants maintained close observation, balancing indulgence with discipline. The continuity of inherited fragility, quiet guidance, and dynastic expectation created a rhythm in which the children moved seamlessly from one duty to the next, their minor vulnerabilities both acknowledged and contained. In Spain, the Bourbon children of Alfonso XIII and Victoria Eugenie continued to reflect centuries of inherited delicate constitution. Some exhibited minor health issues, others a nervous temperament, yet all were carefully monitored by a combination of family, physicians, and tutors. Court records, correspondence, and personal diaries reveal a consistent pattern: attentive observation, careful guidance, and a subtle understanding that these small quirks could influence broader social and political outcomes. Even seemingly trivial matters, sneezing fits, faint paleness, or shyness, were noted, managed, and incorporated into a life carefully orchestrated for both health and dynastic continuity. By the early 20th century, European royal children collectively presented a remarkable panorama of inherited fragility and disciplined upbringing. From the Habsburgs to the Romanovs, the Bourbons to the Savoys, each generation displayed minor physical or emotional anomalies, subtle eccentricities, and inherited tendencies that shaped behavior, alliances, and social standing. Physicians' logs, tutors' diaries, and personal correspondence reveal a quiet continuity, a delicate rhythm of observation, management, and expectation that threaded through centuries, shaping the private lives of heirs in ways both visible and invisible. Even seemingly minor illnesses or delicate temperament had repercussions. A fainting episode in one child might delay a visit. A nervous disposition might influence social engagement. A slight speech peculiarity could affect the impression given at court. Across all of Europe, the subtle interplay of inherited fragility, careful upbringing, and dynastic expectation created a world in which children moved through palaces with quiet attentiveness, their lives shaped by centuries of pattern and expectation, yet lived in delicate, personal moments that rarely made it into the broader history books. The quiet repetition of inherited fragility persisted across generations. Archdukes and princesses, princes and duchesses were all subject to the same rhythms of observation, guidance, and management. Minor physical anomalies, nervous tendencies, and subtle eccentricities appeared repeatedly, quietly influencing marriage negotiations, alliances, and succession planning. Across Austria, Prussia, Russia, Italy, France, and Spain, royal children embodied the cumulative weight of centuries of dynastic expectation, their delicate lives both carefully managed and historically significant in ways often invisible to the casual observer. As we drift further into the early 20th century, the European royal children continued to carry the weight of centuries of expectation, yet their private lives remained delicate, frail, and quietly eccentric. In Russia, the Romanov children were perhaps the most studied example of inherited fragility intersecting with dynastic duty. The Tsarevich Alexei, hemophiliac and physically vulnerable, required constant supervision. Every small cut, bruise, or minor fever was recorded meticulously by physicians, nurses, and sometimes even the children themselves, who grew aware from a young age that their bodies were both precious and perilous. His sisters, while not burdened by a serious disease, inherited a similar nervous sensitivity from the intermarried European bloodlines that traced back through generations of cautious unions. Olga, the eldest, often exhibited a quiet sense of responsibility mixed with a certain melancholy. Tatiana, more outwardly composed, nevertheless showed signs of anxiety under pressure. Maria, gentle and affectionate, could be prone to sudden bursts of emotion, and Anastasia, the youngest, carried a curious mixture of vivacity tempered by a subtle awareness of her own fragility. Together, they lived in the shadow of inherited delicacy, each child's personality subtly shaped by the intertwined threads of family expectation and physical vulnerability. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduchess Elizabeth, the daughter of Franz Ferdinand, grew up with a careful attention to health that was almost ritualistic. A faint blush could summon a nurse. A slight cough would trigger consultation with a physician, and any sudden burst of temper or impatience was quietly logged by her governess. These children, raised in grand palaces with heavily regimented routines, moved through a world where every sneeze, sigh, or pallor was not only observed but interpreted as an indicator of future suitability for marriage, leadership, and social representation. The children of lesser archdukes and archduchesses displayed similar patterns: minor tremors, subtle shyness, slight eccentricities of speech or posture, all carefully recorded and, when possible, managed. In these environments, inherited fragility was less a source of shame than a quietly acknowledged reality, influencing not only daily life but also the broader currents of courtly politics. Germany's imperial children, from Wilhelm II's household, exhibited a slightly different pattern of delicacy. The young princes and princesses, though outwardly spirited, were subject to intense observation by tutors, governesses, and physicians. Wilhelm's own childhood had been marked by constant supervision, dietary regulation, and careful management of minor illnesses, and these patterns were meticulously reproduced in his children's lives. Small nervous tics, minor bouts of fatigue, or brief spells of melancholy were treated with quiet seriousness, and even minor quirks could influence expectations for public life or dynastic marriage. These children, carefully guided and constantly monitored, carried forward centuries of inherited fragility, with personalities shaped as much by physical constitution as by social expectation. In Italy, the Savoy princes and princesses displayed the same blend of inherited delicacy and careful upbringing. Though the political landscape was shifting, the palaces of Turin and Naples remained spaces of meticulous observation. Children were watched for minor health anomalies, nervous tendencies, and subtle eccentricities, each carefully noted in diaries and reports. Even trivial traits, such as a tendency toward timidity or a slight stammer, were considered in the broader dynastic calculus. The delicate rhythm of these young lives, structured routines, constant supervision, and gentle intervention persisted across generations, creating a continuity of fragile yet resilient heirs, quietly moving through palaces and public appearances with carefully managed comportment. The Spanish Bourbons, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, exemplified another facet of inherited fragility. Alfonso XIII's children, though outwardly healthy and charming, displayed subtle signs of inherited vulnerability, occasional fainting spells, minor nervous episodes, and delicate constitutions that required close attention. These children were observed not only for physical health but also for temperament and social aptitude. Even minor eccentricities, shyness, sudden bursts of emotion, or peculiar habits were gently corrected or accommodated. The palaces in Madrid were filled with governesses, tutors, and physicians, all quietly documenting every nuance of behavior and health, creating a detailed map of childhood delicacy that intertwined with political strategy and dynastic expectation. The intermarriage of European dynasties ensured that inherited fragility persisted across borders. A slight pallor, a nervous tic, or a minor speech difficulty in one child could be traced to centuries of selective unions between houses, each aimed at consolidating power but also reinforcing certain physical or emotional traits. In Austria, Prussia, and Russia, the repeated patterns of delicate constitution and subtle eccentricity were visible in children from birth. Physicians' notes, private correspondence, and memoirs of governesses reveal a meticulous tracking of minor anomalies, from fainting spells to nervousness to moments of unexplained fatigue. These were not dramatic events, but quiet, recurrent features that shape personality and social expectation in ways rarely acknowledged outside the family or court. Even in the smaller principalities of Europe, the same patterns persisted. In Hesse, Baden, and Mecklenburg, minor physical vulnerabilities and subtle eccentricities were carefully observed and managed. A child's unusual gait, slight stoop, or timid voice could influence marriage negotiations and social positioning, making seemingly trivial characteristics matters of dynastic significance. These children, though often less publicly visible than heirs to major thrones, nonetheless carried forward centuries of delicate constitution and meticulously guided upbringing, contributing quietly to the intricate web of European aristocratic life. Scandinavian royal children exhibited a similarly delicate rhythm, though with slightly more robustness physically. In Denmark and Sweden, minor nervous tendencies, subtle speech peculiarities, or occasional bouts of fatigue were carefully monitored, yet daily life maintained a slightly more relaxed flow than in the Central European courts. Even so, routines of education, exercise, and socialization were strictly adhered to, ensuring that inherited traits were observed and guided with quiet diligence. Children learned early that subtlety of behavior and grace of conduct were as important as physical health, weaving inherited fragility into the daily rhythms of palace life. Across all of Europe, the quiet continuity of inherited fragility and structured upbringing persisted. Children were simultaneously heirs, symbols, and delicate vessels of dynastic expectation. Minor illnesses, subtle nervous tendencies, and inherited eccentricities were managed with gentle care, documented meticulously, and subtly woven into broader dynastic strategies. In every palace across Austria, Germany, Russia, Italy, France, Spain, and the smaller principalities, a remarkable pattern emerged. Delicate children moving through structured routines, subtly shaped by inherited traits, quietly observed and managed, and quietly influencing the social, political, and dynastic landscape around them. By the early 20th century, the delicate patterning of European royal children had become almost predictable. Archdukes and princesses, princes and duchesses moved through palaces with careful attention to health and temperament. Minor eccentricities, fragile constitutions, and nervous tendencies were all quietly monitored. Even trivial issues, slight pallor, a minor stammer, or transient fatigue, were treated with gentle care. These children, living at the intersection of inherited fragility and dynastic expectation, carried forward centuries of subtle patterning that influenced not only their private lives, but also the broader network of European alliances and social structures. Marriage negotiations remained a silent arbiter of inherited traits. Across the continent, royal families sought alliances that accounted not only for political advantage, but also for compatible physical and emotional constitutions. Minor nervous tendencies, subtle fragility, or slight eccentricities were carefully noted, influencing decisions that affected succession, diplomacy, and family continuity. Letters, diaries, and physicians' reports meticulously recorded these subtleties, creating an intricate web of quiet influence, ensuring that the delicate children of Europe's royal houses were both heirs and instruments of dynastic strategy. The continuity of inherited fragility extended into the minutiae of daily life. Courtiers, governesses, and physicians meticulously monitored routines, diet, posture, and social interactions. Even minor physical anomalies, slight stoops, tremors, or unusual gait were quietly observed. Emotional sensitivity, nervous tendencies, and shy behavior were gently managed and subtly corrected. Across courts, children learned to navigate a delicate balance, appearing robust and competent while remaining under careful supervision, their lives shaped by centuries of pattern and expectation. In France, the Orléans children maintained similar rhythms. Even as political upheaval reshaped the country, the palaces remained spaces of delicate observation. Children displayed inherited tendencies toward nervousness, mild physical frailty, and subtle eccentricities, all carefully guided by tutors and physicians. These patterns, repeated across generations, reinforced a quiet continuity, a world in which minor quirks of body and temperament were both acknowledged and managed, influencing alliances, education, and social standing. Italy's Savoy children, now moving into the early 20th century, continued this delicate tradition. Minor health issues, nervous tendencies, and subtle eccentricities were carefully recorded. Education, exercise, and socialization followed strict routines designed to balance delicate constitution with dynastic expectation. Even small anomalies, slight fatigue, nervous shyness, or minor speech peculiarities were carefully managed, ensuring that the children moved seamlessly through public and private life, carrying forward centuries of fragile continuity, Spain's Bourbons, similarly, continued the pattern of inherited delicacy. Alfonso XIII's children displayed subtle physical vulnerabilities, minor nervous tendencies, and occasional eccentricities, all carefully observed by tutors, physicians, and attendants. Court diaries and correspondence record these small details with remarkable consistency, revealing a quiet preoccupation with subtle traits that could influence dynastic planning and social perception. Children learned to navigate their fragile constitutions within structured routines of observation and gentle intervention, preserving centuries of inherited patterns. Across all of Europe, the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced a remarkable continuity of fragile childhoods, structured upbringing, and subtle eccentricity. Archdukes, princes, duchesses, and princesses moved through palaces with quiet attention to health and temperament. Minor ailments, delicate nerves, and inherited eccentricities were carefully monitored and subtly managed. These children, heirs to centuries of dynastic expectation, embodied the rhythm of life that was at once delicate, structured, and historically consequential, a subtle undercurrent shaping alliances, marriages, and the social fabric of European courts. By the mid 1910s, the world outside European palaces had begun to shift dramatically, yet the lives of royal children remained anchored in inherited fragility and carefully regimented routines. The Russian Romanovs, still residing in the Winter Palace, maintained the same patterns of observation and delicate care for their children, despite mounting external pressures. Alexei, perpetually at risk from his hemophilia, required constant supervision, and each minor accident was recorded in meticulous detail. The four Grand Duchesses, accustomed to a life of quiet attention and delicate routines, continued to navigate their structured days with the same mix of caution and nervous charm. Olga remained thoughtful and introspective, often quietly correcting her younger sister's exuberance. Tatiana retained her composed exterior, though occasional small tremors of anxiety surfaced when obligations seemed overwhelming. Maria, gentle and empathetic, experienced occasional bouts of frustration at her restricted world. And Anastasia, the youngest, combined a vivacious curiosity with an undercurrent of self-awareness, knowing she was both fragile and closely watched. The combination of delicate health, inherited patterns, and constant observation created an almost ethereal rhythm where every sigh, sneeze, and blush carried significance, yet life unfolded in the quiet cadence of palace routines. In Austria, the children of the Habsburg dynasty continued to live under strict observation, though the pressures of war had begun to make their routines more somber. Archduchess Elizabeth, along with her siblings, was still raised with meticulous attention to diet, exercise, and social poise, but the backdrop of political upheaval subtly infused their education with a sense of solemnity. Minor tremors, fainting spells, and subtle nervous tendencies were all carefully noted, and the children were guided to move through life as fragile yet composed figures, symbols of dynastic continuity in uncertain times. The court physician's notes, often filled with intricate detail about pulse rates, sleeping patterns, and faint blushes, reveal a world where fragility and duty intertwined quietly, forming the foundation of the children's social and emotional development. In Germany, the children of Kaiser Wilhelm II navigated a similarly delicate existence, though the influence of military precision added a particular rhythm to their upbringing. Education and social training were rigorous, but minor eccentricities, physical vulnerabilities, and subtle nervous tendencies were carefully managed. Even as the country prepared for larger conflicts, the children's daily routines remained oriented around careful observation, health monitoring, and quiet correction of small quirks. Minor tics, nervous gestures, or slight fatigue were all treated seriously, with the understanding that these children, while physically fragile, were also embodiments of the empire's continuity and prestige. Italy's Savoy children in the palaces of Turin and Rome also experienced the continuation of this delicate patterning. Slight tremors, minor speech difficulties, and occasional bouts of nervousness were carefully noted by governesses and physicians, and structured routines guided their daily lives. Even as political unrest grew, the children remained insulated within layers of observation, moving through days filled with lessons, etiquette practice, and health supervision. Small anomalies were treated not as defects but as natural variations, quietly managed and subtly shaped to align with dynastic expectations. In Spain, the Bourbons' children similarly experienced lives of gentle fragility. Alfonso XIII's offspring, while outwardly charming and capable, displayed inherited tendencies toward physical delicacy, minor nervous quirks, and subtle eccentricities. Court diaries and correspondence reveal an almost obsessive attention to the smallest details: a faint blush, a hesitant word, or a sudden change in mood. Each observation was gently recorded, influencing future expectations for social engagement, marriage, and dynastic planning. Children learned early to navigate a delicate balance, appear composed, manage inherited fragility, and accommodate the quiet oversight of adults who understood that small eccentricities could ripple across generations. Throughout Europe, the careful observation of royal children persisted as a consistent pattern. Physicians, governesses, and attendants meticulously documented every minor anomaly, from fainting spells to fleeting nervous gestures. Even small emotional tendencies, shyness, irritability, or excessive sensitivity were quietly managed. The children's daily routines followed precise rhythms: rising, meals, lessons, supervised play, physical exercise, and carefully timed rest. In these patterns, subtle fragility was normalized, incorporated seamlessly into social and dynastic expectations, and quietly shaped the future roles of these young heirs. Francis Orleans' children maintained the same structure, though with occasional variations influenced by political shifts. Minor health vulnerabilities, nervous tendencies, and subtle eccentricities were observed with the same meticulous care. Education, etiquette, and social interactions were all guided to ensure that children presented themselves as composed, delicate, and suitable heirs to centuries of tradition. Even trivial anomalies, pallor, small tremors, or fleeting shyness were noted and subtly accommodated. The result was a continuity of fragile yet managed childhoods, where small details shaped the broader trajectory of dynastic life. The Scandinavian monarchies also maintained traditions of careful upbringing, though with a slightly more relaxed rhythm. In Denmark and Sweden, minor nervous tendencies, delicate constitution, and occasional eccentricities were observed, but daily routines allowed for slightly more flexibility. Children were still subject to guidance, supervision, and gentle correction, yet the atmosphere allowed for slightly more spontaneous development. Even here, patterns of inherited fragility persisted, and children learned early to manage both their physical delicacies and the expectations imposed by dynastic tradition. The smaller German principalities Hesse, Baden, Mecklenburg, and the like continued to follow the established pattern of careful observation and structured upbringing. Even minor eccentricities, subtle nervous tendencies, or slight physical vulnerabilities could influence marriage negotiations, social positioning, or dynastic strategy. Courtiers, physicians, and tutors meticulously documented these traits, ensuring continuity and adherence to centuries of tradition. The children, while less publicly visible than heirs to major thrones, nonetheless carried forward the fragile and structured rhythms of aristocratic life. As World War I erupted, the continuity of fragile royal childhoods intersected with the harsh realities of political upheaval. Palaces remained spaces of careful observation and structured routines, yet the external environment introduced new sources of stress and anxiety. Children continued to be observed for physical vulnerabilities, nervous tendencies, and minor eccentricities, but the backdrop of war added subtle tension. In Russia, the Romanov children moved through days of meticulous monitoring, yet the shadow of political unrest and the demands of their father's court added a quiet undercurrent of tension to their otherwise structured lives. Similarly, in Austria, Germany, and other monarchies, the structured management of delicate children persisted, though with additional layers of caution in light of wartime uncertainties. Despite these pressures, the intrinsic patterns of fragile royal childhoods endured. Minor ailments, slight tremors, nervous tendencies, and inherited eccentricities continue to be observed and managed with gentle precision. Children navigated routines of education, socialization, and etiquette, learning to maintain composure and manage delicate constitutions under constant supervision. Even as the world outside palaces grew chaotic, the microcosm of royal childhood preserved a quiet continuity where inherited fragility and meticulous observation defined daily life. The meticulous recording of minor details persisted across courts. Diaries, physician notes, and governess reports revealed the subtle ways in which small quirks, minor health issues, and inherited tendencies were documented and managed. A faint blush could prompt dietary adjustments. A nervous gesture might result in guided exercises. A minor tremor could lead to gentle correction or accommodation. These practices, repeated across Europe, ensured that fragile children were both protected and subtly shaped to meet dynastic expectations. Royal children, even when outwardly robust, displayed subtle vulnerabilities that demanded attention. In Italy, France, Spain, and Germany, slight physical fragility, nervous tendencies, and minor eccentricities were carefully monitored. Children learned to balance self awareness, inherited delicacy, and social expectation. These patterns, recurring across generations and borders, formed an almost invisible network of continuity, linking the lives of royal children across Europe through inherited traits, meticulous care, and structured routines. Marriage arrangements remained a silent instrument in managing inherited fragility. Across Europe, dynasties sought alliances that balanced political advantage with compatible physical and emotional traits. Minor eccentricities, subtle nervous tendencies, and fragile constitutions were noted in private correspondence, influencing decisions that could affect succession, diplomacy, and social positioning. Children were subtly prepared to embody these considerations, learning to present themselves as both delicate and composed, reflecting the centuries old patterns of aristocratic life. By the 1920s, even as monarchies faced challenges and the social landscape evolved, the patterning of royal childhoods remained largely intact. Archdukes, princes, duchesses, and princesses continued to be observed for minor ailments, subtle nervous tendencies, and inherited eccentricities. Daily routines followed strict schedules, balancing education, exercise, social training, and rest. Courtiers, physicians, and governesses continued to meticulously record anomalies, ensuring continuity in the management of delicate lives. Across Europe, children learned to navigate the intersection of inherited fragility and dynastic expectation, moving through structured days with the quiet composure that centuries of tradition had instilled. The persistence of these patterns underscores a remarkable historical continuity. Across Austria, Germany, Russia, Italy, France, Spain, Scandinavia, and smaller principalities, the lives of royal children were defined not by dramatic events but by subtle observation, meticulous care, and the quiet shaping of delicate traits. Physical fragility, minor eccentricities, and inherited nervous tendencies were integrated into daily routines, influencing education, socialization, and long term expectations. Even as political upheavals reshaped the continent, the careful observation of young heirs persisted, preserving centuries of aristocratic patterning and the quiet rhythm of fragile childhoods. By the mid 1920s, the rhythms of royal childhoods across Europe had settled into a predictable cadence, a delicate balance between inherited fragility and the careful imposition of structure. In the Russian emigre communities, children of minor Romanovs, now displaced from palaces, yet still under the subtle pressures of dynastic expectation, maintained the quiet patterns of observation and meticulous care that had been their birthright. Even without the grandeur of the Winter Palace, minor tremors, faint blushes, and subtle nervous tendencies continued to be noted by governesses, tutors, and relatives. The children's daily routines, early rising, measured lessons, carefully monitored meals, limited but structured play remained almost ritualistic, echoing the forms established before the revolution. Small health vulnerabilities were managed with patience and precision, and minor emotional fluctuations were observed as data points, quietly influencing expectations for the future. Meanwhile, across Western Europe, the Habsburg children of Vienna and Budapest continued to navigate a world of delicate fragility, now colored by the after effects of the Great War. Archdukes and archduchesses, though less publicly prominent, remained subject to intense scrutiny. Faint tremors, minor speech hesitations, slight anemia, and subtle nervous quirks were meticulously documented, often in notebooks that read like botanical journals cataloging every nuance of a fragile plant. Even fleeting signs of impatience, mild irritability, or anxious hesitation were treated as meaningful indicators of both physical and emotional disposition. Tutors and governesses adjusted lessons accordingly, balancing mental exercise with periods of quiet rest, and physicians ensured that minor ailments never escalated beyond manageable thresholds. In Germany, the offspring of former imperial families continued the same delicate routine, shaped by decades of expectation and centuries of tradition. Minor eccentricities were observed with the same patient, slightly ironic attention. A prince who occasionally twitched his fingers while concentrating was guided gently through exercises in stillness. A young duchess prone to fainting in warm sunlight received careful instructions on posture and hydration. The persistence of inherited fragility, combined with subtle temperament quirks, dictated not only daily behavior but also long-term educational planning. Even within diminished courts or private estates, the children's lives were curated as precise microcosms of aristocratic continuity. The Italian Savoy children, now slightly older, remained guided by the twin imperatives of delicacy and decorum. Faint tremors, nervous gestures, and inherited susceptibility to minor illnesses continued to be recorded meticulously. Governesses orchestrated daily schedules that integrated lessons in etiquette, geography, languages, and fine arts with periods of measured physical exercise intended to strengthen but not strain. Play was always monitored, as even small bursts of exuberance could exacerbate minor weaknesses. Emotional tendencies, whether gentle shyness or moments of fiery frustration, were observed in private diaries and shaped future expectations for marital prospects and public comportment. The careful management of delicate traits extended into every social and educational interaction, ensuring that each child could navigate aristocratic life while remaining physically and emotionally proper. In Spain, the Bourbon children of Alfonso XIII maintained similar routines, though with occasional allowances for mild spontaneity in private gardens and quiet courtly retreats. Nervous tendencies, slight anemia, and subtle eccentricities were catalogued in extensive correspondence between physicians and tutors. Even brief episodes of emotional impatience, an outburst at a table, a reluctant bow, or a tremor of frustration during a lesson were carefully noted and incorporated into plans for the child's future management. Children grew up knowing that composure, delicacy, and precise self regulation were not just desirable but necessary, and they internalized these expectations from an early age. France, still recovering from the trauma of the First World War, offered a quieter stage for Orléans and Bourbon descendants. Here, minor ailments, subtle nervous quirks, and gentle eccentricities were observed with a similar combination of meticulous care and slightly ironic detachment. Diaries reveal subtle attention to the smallest details. The angle of a child's posture during lessons, the faintest blanching of a cheek, the trembling of a hand while attempting calligraphy. These children, though outwardly composed, carried inherited delicacy in every movement, shaped by generations of careful oversight and subtle management. The Scandinavian royal children, though living in generally more relaxed courts, remained firmly within the tradition of careful observation. Denmark and Sweden, while offering slightly more flexibility in daily routines, still emphasized composure, decorum, and the quiet management of inherited fragility. Minor eccentricities, gestures, speech patterns, and fleeting moments of nervous hesitation were recorded and gently shaped through guidance and instruction. Even in less rigid courts, the patterns established over centuries persisted, a quiet testament to the resilience of aristocratic norms and the enduring significance of inherited traits. In smaller German principalities, where the scale of courts was more modest, children continued to be raised under the same principles. Minor ailments, subtle tremors, and inherited eccentricities remained key points of observation. Physical delicacy, slight nervous tendencies, and fragile emotional dispositions were treated with careful attention. Daily routines were regimented to ensure both mental stimulation and physical well being, while social education and etiquette lessons ensured that children could meet the expectations of courtly life without disruption. Even when the broader political context shifted, these microcosms of aristocratic care preserved centuries of tradition. Throughout Europe, the careful recording of minor quirks, subtle nervous tendencies, and inherited frailty was a continuous practice. Diaries, physician notes, and governors' reports reveal a world in which even the smallest gesture, a tremor of the hand, a blush of the cheek, a hesitant bow, carried meaning. These observations shaped not only the child's immediate experience, but also expectations for marriage, diplomacy, and future roles. Physical delicacy and emotional subtlety became intertwined with social performance, and the patterns established in childhood echoed across the generations. By the late 1920s, interwar Europe presented a subtly shifting landscape for royal children. Many dynasties were reduced in influence, or dispossessed, yet the traditions of careful observation and meticulous care persisted. Children were raised in private estates, small palaces, or even modest residences, but the essential patterns remained: early rising, structured lessons, supervised play, measured exercise, and careful attention to health and emotional state. Minor eccentricities and inherited frailties continued to guide daily life, shaping the children into composed figures capable of embodying dynastic continuity even in diminished circumstances. In Russia, Romanov children living in exile maintained routines reminiscent of their earlier lives. Physical fragility, faint tremors, and subtle emotional tendencies were managed with the same careful attention as before the revolution. Even without grand palaces, these children moved through days filled with lessons, supervised play, and quiet observation, perpetuating centuries of aristocratic patterns. Subtle eccentricities were noted in diaries, and minor ailments were addressed with gentle care, ensuring that the delicate balance of inherited fragility and social expectation endured. Austria's Habsburg children, in the aftermath of imperial collapse, were similarly guided through routines designed to preserve both health and composure. Faint tremors, minor nervous tendencies, and subtle eccentricities were managed with careful attention, integrated into daily schedules that combined education, exercise, and rest. These children learned early to navigate the quiet expectations of aristocratic life, balancing inherited delicacy with the social demands of family and society. Even in reduced circumstances, the careful observation of fragile traits remained central to upbringing. In Germany, former imperial children moved through similarly structured routines. Physical delicacy, minor eccentricities, and subtle emotional tendencies were observed and managed with meticulous care. Even in estates far from Berlin, daily life followed the rhythms of careful monitoring, precise education, and quiet correction of small anomalies. Children were instructed in social comportment, etiquette, and the management of inherited quirks, preparing them to maintain dynastic continuity in a changing world. Italy's Savoy children continued under close supervision. Subtle nervous tendencies, minor ailments, and inherited frailty guided daily schedules, shaping lessons, exercise, and supervised play. Emotional sensitivity, mild irritability, and fleeting anxiety were incorporated into careful observations, subtly informing expectations for social interaction, marriage, and public presentation. The continuity of these patterns reflects a persistent aristocratic attention to inherited traits and the quiet shaping of delicate childhoods. Spain's Bourbon children remained within a similar pattern: minor tremors, subtle nervous gestures, and fragile constitutions were meticulously documented by tutors and physicians. Even small emotional fluctuations, a blush, a sigh, a hesitation, were treated as significant. Children learned to move through their days with measured composure, balancing the management of inherited frailty with the expectations of dynastic life. This careful cultivation of delicate traits ensured continuity across generations, even as the political landscape shifted around them. France's Orleans and Bourbon children experienced comparable attention. Diaries, physician notes, and governess reports record subtle eccentricities, minor nervous tendencies, and faint health vulnerabilities. Lessons, exercises, and social practice were all guided by these observations, forming a structured pattern of childhood that emphasized composure, delicacy, and quiet resilience. Even trivial anomalies were integrated into daily life, reinforcing the persistent influence of inherited fragility on aristocratic upbringing. The Scandinavian royal children, though enjoying slightly more relaxed routines, still move through days guided by careful observation. Minor eccentricities, subtle nervous tendencies, and inherited delicacy were acknowledged and gently shaped through instruction. Play, study, and social engagement were all structured to ensure that children developed composure alongside their natural fragility, preserving patterns of aristocratic care even in less rigid courts. Across all of Europe, the management of royal children reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. Minor physical frailties, subtle emotional tendencies, and inherited eccentricities were quietly observed, documented, and incorporated into daily life. Lessons, exercise, supervised play, and etiquette were all arranged to accommodate and shape these traits. Dynastic continuity was maintained not through dramatic events, but through the careful, almost invisible shaping of delicate childhoods. By the late 1930s, royal children across Europe were navigating a subtly shifting world, yet their daily lives remained remarkably consistent in form. Even as political tides shifted, as some monarchies were reduced in power or influence, the patterns of aristocratic childhood endured, quietly resilient beneath the surface of historical upheaval. In Germany, the former imperial children of the Hohenzollerns moved through estates far from Berlin, their days guided by a careful orchestration of lessons, measured physical activity, and close supervision. Minor tremors of the hands, slight paleness, fleeting blushes, or a subtle hesitation in speech were all quietly noted, with governesses and tutors making subtle adjustments to accommodate these inherited traits. Children were instructed in a manner that simultaneously respected their fragility and instilled composure, cultivating a sense of gentle control over naturally delicate bodies. In Italy, the Savoy offspring continued to experience days filled with precise rhythms. They rose early, their bodies encouraged into mild exercise to strengthen yet never exhaust. Lessons in languages, history, geography, and etiquette were interwoven with periods of measured play, all observed with meticulous attention to the subtleties of nervous tendencies and physical delicacy. Minor eccentricities such as a sudden shyness, a brief hesitation during calligraphy, or a faint blush during conversation were logged and subtly addressed, ensuring that each child remained socially adept while preserving the fragile balance of inherited temperament. Even within the comfort of private estates or smaller palaces, the children's lives were carefully curated, a quiet reflection of centuries of aristocratic practice. Across France, the Orleans and Bourbon children continued a similarly measured upbringing. Diaries and governess reports reveal an almost obsessive attention to detail. The angle of a young hand when grasping a pen, the slight trembling of lips during recitation, the occasional blush in response to praise or mild reprimand. These small observations were far from trivial. They shaped the expectations for future social interactions, diplomatic introductions, and even potential marriage prospects. The cultivation of composure alongside inherited delicacy remained paramount, a subtle yet enduring goal of aristocratic parenting. In Spain, the Bourbon children of Alfonso XIII's lineage were likewise guided through days of careful oversight. Minor tremors, fleeting nervous gestures, and inherited sensitivity were recorded diligently by tutors and physicians. Play and physical activity were managed to prevent overexertion, while lessons and etiquette instruction reinforced the cultivation of poise. Even moments of minor impatience, a frown, or a blush were seen as meaningful, gently corrected, and incorporated into the child's development. The quiet orchestration of these routines created an environment where inherited frailty could coexist with social competence, maintaining the invisible standards of aristocratic continuity. In Scandinavia, royal children enjoyed slightly less rigid courts, yet subtle monitoring persisted. The Swedish and Danish young ones were observed for minor eccentricities, faint nervous tendencies, and inherited delicacy. While play and physical exercise might be granted with more freedom, instruction and supervision remained closely aligned with long-standing patterns. Small tremors, delicate gestures, or faint blushes were acknowledged, with tutors providing gentle guidance to cultivate composure and grace. Even in the more relaxed Scandinavian context, the underlying principles of aristocratic upbringing endured, quietly preserving centuries of tradition. Even in smaller German principalities, the habits of careful observation and structured upbringing continued without interruption. Children moved through their days under the guidance of experienced governesses, tutors, and physicians. Physical frailty, mild nervous tendencies, and subtle emotional vulnerabilities were noted and gently managed. Lessons, play, and exercise were all carefully sequenced to maintain balance, ensuring that inherited delicacy did not impede the child's ability to navigate social expectations or assume future responsibilities within the family. These households, though modest in scale, retained the quiet sophistication of centuries of dynastic practice. By the early 1940s, the European political landscape had changed dramatically, yet the intimate world of aristocratic childhood remained astonishingly insulated. Even as monarchies fell or were threatened, the rhythms of delicate upbringing persisted. In Germany, children of former imperial and princely families continued to be guided through meticulously observed routines. Tremors of the hands, slight anemia, faint blushing, and subtle emotional sensitivities were cataloged with patient attention. Lessons in languages, mathematics, history, and etiquette were punctuated by measured physical activity, supervised play, and rest. Governesses and tutors maintained detailed records, noting even the most fleeting quiver of emotion or gesture of nervousness, ensuring that these inherited traits were respected and subtly molded. In Italy, the Savoy children faced a similar regimen. Their daily lives blended education with gentle physical conditioning, periods of play with quiet instruction in manners and social poise. Subtle quirks, nervous glances, faint blushes, or slight hesitation during lessons were observed as data points guiding individualized attention. Even minor emotional fluctuations, such as impatience or fleeting anxiety, were incorporated into the careful orchestration of their upbringing. These practices, preserved across generations, reinforced both the composure expected of aristocratic children and the quiet acknowledgement of inherited fragility. France's Orleans and Bourbon children continued their measured routines, guided by the same principles of observation, adjustment, and gentle correction. Physical delicacy, subtle nervous tendencies, and inherited eccentricities were integrated into daily life with deliberate care. Lessons, exercise, and social instruction were all sequenced to promote balance, ensuring that children could navigate their roles with poise despite inherited vulnerabilities. Even the most minor quirks, a faint tremor, a blush of the cheek, a hesitant bow, were noted with patient attention, shaping the children's experiences and reinforcing the understated continuity of aristocratic childhood. Spain's Bourbon children, though occasionally permitted more energetic play within the confines of private gardens, remained subject to careful observation. Minor ailments, faint tremors, and nervous gestures were recorded by physicians and tutors alike. Play, study, and social interaction were all orchestrated to maintain composure and accommodate delicate temperaments. Even the smallest emotional fluctuation, a brief sigh, a blush, a moment of impatience was incorporated in the child's development, ensuring that inherited fragility and social expectation coexisted harmoniously. In Scandinavia, royal children continued to enjoy slightly more flexible routines, though careful monitoring persisted. Minor eccentricities, faint tremors, and inherited delicacy were observed with gentle attention, and social instruction remained a key component of daily life. Even in seemingly relaxed environments, the cultivation of poise, composure, and graceful management of delicate traits reflected centuries of aristocratic tradition. Play and physical activity were sequenced with rest and study, creating a rhythm that allowed inherited frailty to be managed without hindrance to social or educational development. By the mid 1940s, these patterns were deeply entrenched. Royal children across Europe, whether in displaced households, smaller estates, or modest palaces, continued to experience lives guided by meticulous observation, subtle correction, and gentle orchestration. Physical delicacy, faint nervous tendencies, and inherited eccentricities were quietly managed, shaping daily routines and social expectations alike. Lessons, exercise, play, and etiquette instruction were sequenced to maintain balance, ensuring that the children could navigate aristocratic life despite fragile constitutions. Even in exile, Romanov children maintained the same rhythms, their lives marked by early rising, measured exercise, structured lessons, and carefully monitored play. Subtle tremors, slight paleness, and nervous gestures were noted in diaries and letters, guiding the approach of tutors and governesses. Emotional fluctuations were addressed gently, creating an environment in which inherited fragility could coexist with social competence and dynastic continuity. These practices, preserved across generations, underscored the enduring principles of aristocratic upbringing. In Germany, former imperial and princely children continued under similar regimes. Physical delicacy, faint nervous tendencies, and subtle eccentricities were documented and addressed with patient care. Lessons in social and academic subjects were balanced with measured exercise, supervised play, and periods of rest. Minor tremors, brief blushing, and slight hesitation in speech or movement were carefully observed, guiding subtle corrections that preserved composure while respecting inherited traits. The quiet orchestration of daily life ensured that fragile children were prepared to navigate social and familial expectations despite their delicate constitutions. Italy's Savoy children likewise remained under careful supervision. Subtle quirks, faint nervous tendencies, and delicate physical constitutions shaped daily schedules, influencing lessons, exercise, play, and social instruction. Minor emotional fluctuations, brief impatience, fleeting anxiety, or hesitancy were integrated into gentle corrections that reinforced composure and poise. Even in times of political uncertainty, the routines and observations that had guided generations persisted, creating an enduring framework for aristocratic childhood. In France, Orléans and Bourbon children continued to live under meticulous oversight. Diaries, tutor notes, and governess reports document minor eccentricities, faint tremors, and inherited fragility, all quietly shaping lessons in social training. Even fleeting gestures, a blush, a nervous glance, a hesitant bow were observed and gently managed. Physical delicacy and emotional subtlety were nurtured in parallel, ensuring that children could navigate aristocratic life without compromising inherited traits. Spain's Bourbon children followed similar routines. Minor tremors, slight nervous gestures, and inherited sensitivity were recorded diligently. Play, study, and social instruction were carefully sequenced to maintain balance, ensuring that children could develop composure alongside inherited frailty. Even small emotional fluctuations, a sigh, a blush, a moment of hesitation were incorporated into guidance and instruction, reinforcing subtle aristocratic norms that had persisted for generations. Scandinavian royal children, though granted more flexibility, remained observed with subtle attention. Minor eccentricities, inherited delicacy, and faint nervous tendencies were noted and gently corrected through instruction, social guidance, and measured exercise. Even playful activities were subtly sequenced to allow periods of rest, maintaining the equilibrium between inherited frailty and social competence. These routines, while appearing relaxed, reflected centuries of aristocratic practice, quietly sustaining the continuity of delicate upbringing. Across Europe, the management of royal children in the 1930s and 1940s exemplifies the persistence of centuries old patterns. Subtle quirks, minor physical frailty, and faint nervous tendencies were continuously observed, recorded, and gently shaped. Lessons, exercise, play, and social instruction were orchestrated to preserve composure, cultivate poise, and respect delicate constitutions. Emotional subtleties, from fleeting blushes to brief tremors, informed guidance and corrections, ensuring that children grew into adults capable of embodying aristocratic continuity despite fragile physical and emotional constitutions. As the 1950s dawned, the rhythm of aristocratic childhood continued with remarkable consistency. In Germany, the surviving princely families had retreated to more modest estates, yet the delicate orchestration of children's lives remained largely intact. Governesses and tutors observed every minor tremor, faint blush, and hesitant gesture, treating each as both a symptom of hereditary fragility and a note in the ongoing composition of social training. Children were guided through lessons in languages, arithmetic, history, and etiquette, interspersed with periods of carefully measured physical exercise. Even simple games, ball rolling, skipping, gentle horseback rides, were sequenced to ensure that energy expenditure never outpaced the fragile balance of constitution. Diaries of tutors from the period describe a relentless but subtle observation. A quiver of the lip when asked to recite poetry, a slight hesitation when performing a bow, or a pale hand resting on the armrest of a chair. These were not seen as mere quirks, but as signals to modulate instruction, nurture composure, and maintain equilibrium between inherited delicacy and the social expectations of aristocracy. In Italy, the Savoy children similarly experienced the life of careful, measured routines. Even as political upheaval had diminished the influence of the monarchy, the rhythm of aristocratic upbringing persisted quietly within private estates. Children rose early, often accompanied by a devoted tutor who would supervise light exercise and practice in posture before lessons began. Lessons were conducted in formal yet gentle tones, emphasizing linguistic precision, historical literacy, and social poise. Physical delicacy, slight paleness, tremors of the hand, or a quiet nervous glance was addressed subtly, sometimes through adjustment of the chair's height, sometimes by rearranging lesson schedules, or simply by providing a quiet word of reassurance. The goal was never to force the child into a rigid mold, but to cultivate a measured balance between inherited sensitivity and social competence. Francis Orleans and Bourbon children continued along similarly orchestrated lines. Diaries and governess reports from the 1950s reveal meticulous attention to small quirks, a hesitation in the voice when reading aloud, a faint blush when receiving praise, or a tremor of the hands during embroidery. These observations informed subtle corrections designed to instill poise without disrupting the child's innate temperament. Lessons were interspersed with quiet periods of observation, light physical activity, and socially guided play, creating a carefully measured rhythm. The children were taught to navigate aristocratic social circles with grace, even as inherited frailty and emotional sensitivity were quietly acknowledged and accommodated. In Spain, the Bourbon children's lives retained a similar structure. Tutors and governesses continued to maintain careful records of minor tremors, faint blushes, and inherited sensitivity. Activities were arranged to maintain a delicate balance. Study periods alternated with gentle play, light exercise, and rest. Even fleeting signs of emotional fluctuation, a sigh, a momentary hesitation, a slight frown were noted and subtly addressed. The orchestration of these routines ensured that inherited delicacy did not hinder the development of composure, social skill, or dynastic presentation. Scandinavian royal children experienced a slightly more relaxed rhythm, yet subtle observation persisted. In Sweden and Denmark, children were permitted freer play, yet tutors and governesses continued to monitor inherited eccentricities and minor frailties. Blushing, slight tremors, faint nervous gestures, and hesitation were observed and gently corrected. The daily schedule still emphasized a balance of study, exercise, rest, and social instruction, ensuring that aristocratic composure was cultivated even in the context of delicate constitutions. Diaries from this period frequently note small achievements, the child maintaining steady posture during a recitation, controlling a tremor while performing a bow, or demonstrating patience in minor social engagements. Each instance was quietly celebrated as evidence of measured progress, reflecting centuries of refined aristocratic pedagogy. By the late 1950s, these carefully structured routines persisted across Europe, quietly insulated from the larger social and political upheavals of the period. Even families displaced by war, exile, or diminished influence continued to orchestrate the lives of their children with meticulous attention. Minor eccentricities, slight tremors, faint blushes, nervous gestures were cataloged in diaries, gently corrected, and incorporated into daily instruction. Play, study, and physical activity were sequenced to maintain a delicate equilibrium, fostering both composure and social skill. This consistency underscores the remarkable resilience of aristocratic practices, reflecting centuries of refinement in managing inherited fragility. Germany's former imperial and princely children continued under vigilant care. Governesses and tutors guided each day with a patient eye, observing tremors, slight anemia, or fleeting nervous gestures. Lessons in mathematics, languages, history, and etiquette were delivered in measured tones, punctuated by careful exercise and supervised play. Even seemingly minor reactions, hesitation in speech, a blush, a quiver of the lip, were logged and adjusted for, maintaining a seamless balance between inherited delicacy and the cultivation of composure. This approach ensured that children could navigate aristocratic society with grace, despite fragile health or temperament. Italy's Savoy children, likewise, followed carefully curated routines. Subtle eccentricities were noted and integrated into the orchestration of daily life. Lessons were alternated with measured physical activity and quiet periods of observation. Minor emotional fluctuations, a brief sigh, a blush, or fleeting impatience were gently addressed. These practices created a rhythm in which inherited frailty was acknowledged, accommodated, and subtly shaped into composure and social skill. The continuity of these practices demonstrates the resilience of aristocratic pedagogy even in a rapidly changing political landscape. In France, the Orléans and Bourbon children continued a life of measured attention. Governesses and tutors observed subtle tremors, slight paleness, and nervous gestures, incorporating these into tailored instruction and gentle correction. Lessons, play, physical exercise, and social interaction were orchestrated to maintain equilibrium between inherited delicacy and composure. Even fleeting gestures, a hesitant bow, a quiver of the lip, a faint blush were treated as meaningful signals in the cultivation of aristocratic poise. These subtle observations and adjustments reflect centuries of carefully honed practices designed to shape delicate children into competent, socially adept adults. Spain's Bourbon children continued to experience carefully structured days. Tremors, minor nervous gestures, faint blushes, and inherited delicacy were all recorded and addressed with subtlety. Study, play, exercise, and rest were sequenced to maintain balance, ensuring the development of social skill and composure. Small emotional fluctuations, a sigh, a brief frown, a hesitation were incorporated into gentle correction, guiding children toward poise while respecting fragile constitutions. Diaries and letters from this period reflect a quiet attentiveness, documenting subtle progress in posture, gesture, speech, and emotional control. Scandinavian royal children experienced slightly more flexible routines, yet inherited delicacy remained under gentle observation. Tutors monitored faint tremors, slight nervous gestures, and minor eccentricities, guiding children with measured instruction, structured play, and periods of rest. Even in freer play, attention to inherited frailty informed the orchestration of activities, ensuring a balance between development, health, and social preparation. Subtle progress, steady recitation, controlled posture, composure during social interaction was quietly recorded, reflecting centuries of aristocratic attention to detail in raising delicate children. By the early 1960s, European royal and aristocratic children continued to navigate lives defined by subtle observation and careful orchestration. Minor eccentricities, inherited fragility, and faint nervous gestures were continuously noted, gently corrected, and incorporated into daily routines. Lessons, social instruction, play, exercise, and rest were sequenced to preserve composure, cultivate poise, and respect delicate temperaments. Emotional subtleties, tremors, slight blushes, and hesitant gestures informed instruction, ensuring that children developed the social competence and grace expected of their class. Even amidst political change and shifting historical circumstances, these practices persisted as a quiet constant, reflecting centuries of carefully honed aristocratic pedagogy. Germany's former princely children remained under attentive supervision. Physical delicacy, faint nervous gestures, and minor eccentricities were observed and addressed through measured instruction. Study periods alternated with gentle exercise and rest, creating a daily rhythm that nurtured both composure and resilience. Even fleeting reactions, a blush, a quiver, a moment of hesitation, were treated as meaningful cues, guiding subtle adjustments in lessons and social practice. This careful orchestration ensured continuity in aristocratic upbringing despite changing social circumstances. Italy's Savoy children experienced similarly structured routines. Observations of minor eccentricities, tremors, and inherited fragility informed lesson plans, social instruction, and play schedules. Emotional fluctuations, brief impatience, fleeting anxiety, or hesitancy were incorporated into gentle corrections designed to cultivate composure. The orchestration of study, exercise, and rest created a rhythm in which delicate children could develop social skill, poise, and measured resilience. This continuity underscores the enduring nature of aristocratic pedagogy. In France, Orléans and Bourbon children continued to be shaped by centuries of careful observation. Tremors, faint blushes, nervous gestures, and inherited fragility were noted and integrated into instruction, play, and social guidance. Even the smallest gestures, a hesitant bow, a slight quiver of the lip, a fleeting blush, were meaningful in the cultivation of composure and grace. The sequencing of lessons, exercise, play, and rest maintained equilibrium between inherited delicacy and social competence, illustrating the subtle sophistication of aristocratic upbringing. Spain's Bourbon children followed similarly measured routines. Minor tremors, faint blushes, nervous gestures, and inherited sensitivity informed lessons, social instruction, and play schedules. Emotional fluctuations, a sigh, a brief hesitation, a momentary frown, were gently addressed. The daily rhythm of study, exercise, play, and rest allowed children to cultivate composure while acknowledging and accommodating inherited frailty. These practices reflect centuries of carefully honed aristocratic methodology, ensuring continuity and subtle refinement in upbringing. Scandinavian royal children, though enjoying slightly more flexibility, remained observed with patient attention. Tremors, minor nervous gestures, inherited delicacy, and small eccentricities were noted and incorporated into instruction and play. Even in freer settings, observation guided subtle adjustments, maintaining a balance between health, development, and social preparedness. Progress was quietly documented. Posture maintained during recitation, controlled gesture during play, composure in social interaction. Each success, no matter how small, was recognized as a continuation of centuries of aristocratic tradition in raising delicate children. By the mid 1960s, European aristocratic children across Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and Scandinavia experienced lives defined by meticulous attention, gentle orchestration, and subtle correction. Minor eccentricities, faint tremors, inherited fragility, and nervous gestures were continuously observed and managed. Lessons, exercise, play, and rest were sequenced to maintain balance, cultivating poise and social skill while acknowledging delicate constitutions. The quiet rhythms of aristocratic upbringing persisted, a constant amidst shifting historical circumstances, reflecting centuries of refinement and careful attention to the subtleties of fragile childhood.